Stephen, you're muted. Could you please unmute your microphone?
Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Communications and Media Annual Lecture here at University of the Arts London, London College of Communication. I'm delighted to welcome, as the first of our annual lecturers, Lana Swartz, who is an Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. Lana holds a master's degree in comparative media studies from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a PhD from the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and before taking up the post as assistant professor at Virginia, she was a postdoctoral researcher at the Social Media Collective of Microsoft Research and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Lana's going to be talking us through ideas and issues raised in her book, New Money, a fascinating look at how payment has become social media. Lana's going to be talking through those issues with us for about 40 minutes, and then there will be a 10 to 12 minute response from Dr. Rebecca Bramall, who is our course leader on the MA Media Communications and Critical Practice here at the college. After that, about 7 o'clock, we will have opportunities for questions. Do type your questions into the chat function, and those will be reported back to me, and I'll be able to communicate directly with Lana. And very, very interesting, I think, to hear now from Lana. Thank you.
All right, so can you hear me and see my slides and all of that? All right, I will take that as a yes and just keep going. Thank you so much for all of you for inviting me. I am so pleased to be able to share some of this work with you, and I'm really looking forward to the response from Rebecca, and also to hear your questions. Over the past few months, I have been approached by friends, relatives, colleagues, even a couple of journalists about whether or not they should move their money into Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies as a precaution ahead of the US presidential election and potential civil unrest or stock market crash that might have followed. I'm not a financial advisor, and I definitely try to avoid giving advice on cryptocurrency investments under any circumstances, but I usually ask people to consider why they want to move their money into Bitcoin and its cousins. Do they think that ATMs or card networks will go down and it will be easier to transact in crypto for some reason? Do they think that the value of the dollar will crash so radically and permanently that crypto becomes a more stable asset? Are they anticipating fleeing the country and want to avoid paying foreign exchange fees? At this point in the conversation, my friend usually explains that they hadn't really thought it out all the way through, and that they're not really imagining any particular scenario or use case. Rather, they're reacting to a deeper sense of uncertainty. There is the general feeling that even the most taken for granted elements in our everyday lives, money for one, are not nearly as reliable as they should be. And isn't there something we should be able to do to prepare? In a 2018 article published in Cultural Studies, I drew from anthropologist Jane Geyer to characterize the temporal orientation of Bitcoin. Geyer suggests that for some time now, public culture has been concerned only with responses to immediate situations and plans for far-off futures. She calls this the evacuation of the near future. You know, this idea that we can't think about the near future, only the immediate and the distant. She traces it to both an evangelical sense of prophecy and to neoliberal macroeconomic theories of growth. Bitcoin aficionados, it seems, have been living in this evacuation of the near future for some time. They have been concerned with a self-prophesized apocalyptic rupture when governments will either be too weak to manage money efficiently or so authoritarian that a sub rosa alternative is necessary, or some combination of both. And indeed, in 2017, I had a conversation with two, big Bitcoin holders who told me that owning Bitcoin was like owning property in the future. It is a stake in a landscape that is only now emerging. And as media studies scholar Finn Brunton and others point out, all money is a bet on the future. We only accept it because we think someone else will accept it tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. The tomorrow where a bet in Bitcoin really pays off isn't quite the near future, but it always feels like it just might be. Bitcoin may not have gone fully mainstream, but its structure of feeling has. As Geyer puts it, many of us now feel like we are living in a parenthetical period between cataclysms. And now the closing parenthesis of that period is becoming overburdened like a breached levee. The waters are pouring over, the distant future has been summoned into the near future, and it feels like the future Bitcoin advocates warned against, the future they conjured. But for now, it does feel like that apocalyptic distant future has been staved off, at least for today and maybe tomorrow. Far beyond this particular moment of political crisis, the US 2020 election, it seems that it's hard to know. So even far beyond it, it seems hard to know which infrastructures we can trust, which rules, political, social, or economic, still apply. And there does seem to be a growing sense that governments are losing the monopoly on money. Whether cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, community currencies like the Bristol pound, or corporate money like American Express points, many people are imagining and taking quite seriously a coming future ever nearer in which private monies replace or at least augment state-issued currency. So my question is how, as a media and communication scholar, is how can communication media studies help us understand this moment? So in order to answer this question, I situate payment as the communication and as the communication media of money within communication media studies. I think about communication as the sharing of information which produces shared meaning, and the media and technologies through which this communication occurs. Money is informational, symbolic, expressive, and mediated. It is thus communication, communicative, and communicated. Money communicates value. I pay you $20, my account is debited and yours credited, but these transactions don't happen telepathically. Instead, they are enacted through media and infrastructures, which are always instantiations of meaning and power relations. I'm, of course, not the first scholar to suggest implicitly or explicitly that money is a form of communication. One of the classic Aristotelian functions of money is to serve as a medium of exchange. Kant found money to be one of the greatest and most usable of means of all human communication. Polanyi thought of money as a semantic system similar to speech or writing. But I should note that my focus here is not on money broadly defined, but on money in its most communicative modality, payment. We often imagine the politics of money as economic. Who has money, who doesn't, and why? But I think a focus on payment allows us to see new meaning and new politics in addition to these more economic questions. Payment technologies aren't just economic, they're circulatory, about the movement of information. All transactions are literally transactions, a carrying across. And so the politics of payment technologies are communication politics. Who gets to control and profit from communication infrastructure? Who gets to access it on what terms? What kinds of traffic gets to travel over it? What we think about as the technologies of money have long tracked alongside the technologies of communication more broadly. Print money, as I shall discuss, follows the same stories we tell about print culture more generally. Like the newspaper, it shored up the nation state as what Benedict Anderson called an imagined community. Some of today's major payment companies like American Express started not in finance, but in mail, competing with the US Federal Post Office to ship letters, checks, and gold across the continent. I often ask audiences what this fourth picture is with rotary phone, card swiper, and keypad, and I usually get blank stares, but it's a dial-up modem point of sale system. Indeed, the very same technologies used to build the early internet were used to build the card networks. And when I was a little kid, I can remember, small mom and pop shops having to hang up the phone in order to swipe a card and use a dial-up modem. And you can still hear modem noises coming out of the ATMs in the backs of, certain sketchy bars if you're so lucky to go to a bar in 2020. And of course, today, mobile phones and social media are the site of innovation for our communicative world, including money. And the repeating themes in the history of money are communication themes. The history of payment bears traces of ongoing conflicts between geography and speed, individual identity and collective accountability, private control and the public interest. It's really clear that money is media when we look at paper money at the symbolic level. The design of state currency tells us something about how nations would like to be seen. Communication scholar Josh Lauer describes how banknotes produced in Massachusetts during the American Revolutionary War feature a sword-wielding patriot holding an unfurled Magna Carta with the inscription, "Issued in defense of American liberty." Emily Gilbert describes how early Canadian currency was decorated with the landscapes typical to the large country, depicted as bucolic rather than heroic, mundane, not mythological. This imagery implies an audience for monetary media. The British Museum's paper curator, Virginia Hewitt, therefore understands print money as offering an unparalleled opportunity for officially sanctioned propaganda to color the recipient's view. Anthropologist Robert John Foster describes how Melanesians understand paper money as the skin of the state, the site where they might look for news about relationships to the powerful forces brought by contact with white people and their institutions. There have been moments of popular pressure to use the medium of state currency to tell new kinds of stories. In 2015, U.S. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew announced that President Jackson would be placed on the $20 bill by abolitionist Harriet Tubman. There was a lot of public excitement, including various mock-ups about what this new 20 might look like. This one is one of my favorite because it emphasizes the heroic life of Tubman, who led 13 missions to rescue enslaved people, rather than the more staid image we get from the existing photographs of her. In unsurprising but disappointing blow to those who hoped that U.S. currency could be used to value the histories of women and African Americans, the plan was scuttled under the Trump administration in 2017. Trump described his reticence to replace Jackson thus, and this is the closest you're going to get to a Trump impression out of me. He said, "Jackson had a great history, and I think it's rough when you take someone off of the bill. I don't like seeing it. Yes, I think it's pure political correctness. Been on the bill for many, many years." According to the reality show contestant and former White House advisor, Omarosa Manigault Newman, Trump's motivations were even simpler. He reportedly looked at an image of Tubman and balked at the idea. "You want me to put that face on the $20 bill? The skin of the state, indeed." In 2018, though, artist Dana Wall produced stamps designed to superimpose Tubman's face on top of Jackson's. He sold the stamps and provided resources for 3D printing one's own. Wall wrote of the project, "This country and its government have a serious problem with representation. Who we choose to honor as a society affects the moral attitudes that are baked into us as we grow up. The impact that seeing the face of Harriet Tubman staring back at you from a $20 bill should not be underestimated. This sort of representation can subtly but deeply affect someone's conception of themselves and their place in society. The slightly subversive nature of it being currency that's been hand-stamped by another human makes the discovery of one of these bills all the more joyous." There are precedents, of course, for remixing the paper media or the media of paper money. For example, anthropologist Karen Strassler describes how the medium of state currency was remediated, to use the term coined by media studies scholars Bolter and Grusin, in post-Suharto Indonesia through stickers bearing the face of the opposition party candidate. Strassler writes, "This practice transformed the state fetish of money into an artifact of their critical and utopian imaginings and has become an integral feature of contemporary Indonesian political communications." So across historical and cultural contexts, print money has become the site of media controversy, of dramas over representation, with the goal of telling new stories about the past, present, and future. And each of these examples shows how print money is not merely used to transmit value, although it certainly does that, but used to produce a shared social reality. In each example, money's audiences have tried to renegotiate its meaning, to recreate mass media as popular culture. And this can happen without decorating money or creating new money. So today, US Sacagawea dollar coins are commonly used in Ecuador, where they circulate alongside Ecuadorian minted currency. And according to the anthropologist Taylor Nelms, Ecuadorians have adopted the image of the North American Leme Shoshone woman Sacagawea, who served as a guide on the Lewis and Clark expedition, as particularly Andean, offering a kind of Pan-American indigeneity. So sometimes we can overtly see the ways in which monetary media become popular culture, and sometimes we can't. So as we rethink money as media, it's important to think beyond the somewhat obvious example of paper money and questions of representation, and to look at how less indexical payment technology, digital infrastructures, too can afford a structure of feeling. So as MediaSay scholar Jonathan Stern notes, social reality is made not only at the level of symbols, it is also built and organized, a world of motion and action. So sliding your payment through a cracked car windshield is a distinctly COVID era and maybe particularly American payment moment. So put another way, the communication of money entail not only the production and interpretation of symbolic forms, but the circulation of those forms and the infrastructure through which that communication occurs. Infrastructures, as science and technology scholar Paul Edwards argues, act like laws. He writes, "To live within the multiple interlocking infrastructures of modern societies is to know one's place in gigantic systems that both enable and constrain us." Critical infrastructure studies scholars often cite Robert Moses, a New York City planner who made the decision that the bridges over the Grand Central Parkway would be low in height, too low for public buses to pass through, effectively preventing poor people from traveling easily to and from wealthier suburbs, by design, not policy. And Susan Lee Starr writes, there are millions of tiny bridges built into large-scale information infrastructures, and millions of literal and metaphoric public buses that cannot pass through them. What low bridges are built into today's electronic payment systems, and how do they ensure that we know our place? So if payment is a form of communication, a way of transmitting information that produces shared meaning, communication payment knits us together in a shared economic world, what I call a transactional community, by which I mean the set of relations that are produced by transactional communication. Sociologists and anthropologists often conceive of the relationships between people who transact with each other as networks, circuits, spheres, etc. But in articulating transactional communities, I want to put communication, its media, and its technologies at the center of the collectivities formed through transaction. Communication through the exchange of symbols, the experience of infrastructure, and other forms of what Jane Bennett calls vibrant matter, produce a shared social reality. And I'm calling that shared social reality communication because of the way that being together arises from communication, from countless transactions. So members of a transactional community share imbricated senses of identity, geography, temporality, and value. And money as a communication media performs a relation between people in the moment of transaction, as well as relations between individuals and larger imaginaries we call the economy, society. When we exchange money, we agree not just on its quality, but its meaning, quantity, but its meaning. The technologies of money, which make it transactable and valuable, are the mechanisms of maintaining these shared understandings. And when I think about transactional communities, I always come back to this example. So there are peoples such as the Indo-Greeks who lived on the border of modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan from around 180 BC to 8010, who are knowable only as transactional communities, according to archaeologists such as Frank L. Holt. The only real remaining evidence of them are the coins they left behind. Archaeologists map where ancient coins are found to trace the geography of empire. They divine political change from the tiny portraits of kings that turn metal into money. They read ethnicity into the number systems that mark value. They understand the organization of society through coin fabrication techniques. For these scholars, numismatics is a way of uncovering lost civilizations. Coins, the ancient payment technology, called the Indo-Greek civilization into being and can be used to uncover it. There is a sense that we've moved from an era of mass media into an era of social media. The mass media era, of course, has been characterized by the unified, collective, and passive experience of concentrated, unidirectional mass distribution technologies. And the social media era has been characterized by a participatory, peer-to-peer, globalized, but deeply surveilled experience of digital media. Similarly, what we're seeing now is a shift from mass money media to mass social media and mass money social media. And in turn, what could be called mass from mass transactional communities to what could be called social transactional communities. So what is the implied mass media money form that is being disrupted? So one answer could be state currency, which is universal public print media, is absolutely a mass media form. Virginia Hewitt described state-issued currency as the most mass-produced objects in the world, painstakingly designed for millions of people to use. Paper money may, in fact, be the most ubiquitous form of print media, even today. And cash as a transactional technology is universal. It is, to quote the US dollar bill, legal tender for all debts, public and private. It's one of those big public infrastructures of modernity, like the federal post office or the highway system. But state-issued currency is actually a relatively new technological achievement. Historically, more often than not, money has been private and plural. In the United States, state-issued currency wasn't fully consolidated until after the Civil War. Prior to that, foreign currencies, private banknotes, and scrip produced by railroads, insurance companies, and other businesses circulated alongside currency issued by the US Treasury. Historian David Hinken describes how in cities like Antebellum, New York, where lots of different kinds of money circulated, everyday spending required considerable street smarts. Bills may have come from a failed bank or a fictitious bank, or may be a counterfeit copy of a note from a functioning real bank. Bills that were accepted at face value in one city may only be accepted at a lower value in others. Living in the city meant learning how to navigate a messy, complex monetary media environment. This monetary cacophony also created highly stratified transactional communities. While the wealthy used notes by stable banks and redeemable for bullion and letters of credit, the poor were more likely to use low-value bronze or copper petty coins or deprecated banknotes. As political scientist Eric Hellener describes, the result was a tiered monetary order rather than a coherent national one, in which economic communication between rich and poor was inhibited by the existence of a fluctuating and unclear exchange rate between the respective forms of money used by these two classes. It also created the opportunity for exploitation. For example, American mining and lumber companies commonly use company scrip for the workers as salary, which could only be redeemed at the company store, obligating employees to make purchases there, often at high markups. In other cases, employers would intentionally buy notes of deprecated value to, as one 1835 account put it, palm off upon their workmen as money. Historian Josh R. Greenberg explains, in order to be able to use those notes with most merchants, the workers would have to exchange them to money brokers for notes that traded at face value, paying fees to money changers in the process. The 1835 writer described this use of money as a direct and infamous fraud upon the working classes. National currencies, then, were designed to enact transactional communities the scope and scale of the nation. The so-called one country, one money principle quilted together national imaginaries of membership and market to a geographic terrain. So instead of the stratified monetary cacophony, state-issued paper money unified classes into an economic polity with a, as Hellener puts it, common economic language, whose members could at least do business with each other, engage in commerce, if not always conversation. State-issued currencies shore up the power and sovereignty of nation states and extend the Enlightenment project of citizenship to the means of payment. Cash pulled people together in a national community of shared fate that, as Eugene Weber puts it, turned peasants into Frenchmen, creating citizens of a liberal transactional public. But all those who use cash need not be citizens of a state. A transactional community is more inclusive, albeit on unequal terms, than a state. One of my favorite examples of a post-national currency that follows along the same lines are the Euro notes, which were designed to imagine the European community as a transactional community, to create a shared sense of unspecific Europeanness and is adorned with imaginary bridges and arches and architecture that conjures a shared architectural past that can be projected into a shared future, but of course exists nowhere, fully imaginary. Of course, the dichotomy between mass media and social media and their accompanying transactional communities is vexed. There are problems with imagining that history happens in these kind of neat, descript phases. And it's useful to think broadly. While it's useful to think broadly about kind of the mass media era and the social media era, reality is almost always far messier. So even at the height of the so-called broadcast age, people still shared some of the most important information by word of mouth, over the back fence, through office memo, and received much of their journalism from overtly partisan newspapers. Today, social media itself has become a new form of mass media, with Facebook, for example, certainly as massive as any television network, and with many of the links that are shared on it connecting to mass media content producers. So too, that the idea that 20th century transactional communities were as public, universal order of liberal citizenship, as I've described, is similarly fraught. State-issued currency has long been remediated by other forms that create niche, hierarchical transactional communities. So, for example, the Diners Club card, the first universal payment card, was literally indeed like a private club. It emerged at a time when Americans were suddenly moving much faster and further than their money could. The highway system, motels, rental cars, democratized jet travel, the business trip, these were all mid-century inventions. But the US banking system was still relatively regional. It was easy to travel, but without ATMs or branch banking or easily trusted out-of-town checks, it was hard to pay for things on the road. The Diners Club card, which debuted in 1950, could be used far from home. Anywhere the card was accepted, a member could make a purchase. The card then was as much a technology of movement, of wayfinding, as it was a financial instrument. So when it was debuted, it was talked about as an exclusive economic space or transactional community that overlaid and remade existing geography. It marked its members as an elite group to whom, quote unquote, country club style billing, as the practice of receiving a folio bill was commonly called, was available at an expanding number of merchants. The feeling of being known and trusted was no longer limited to a particular shop or a particular club in a particular city, but spread out wherever the Diners Club card was accepted. Members could walk into any establishment anywhere in the world, or at least at most US cities, highway corridors, international tourist locales, and put it on the tab, as though they were members of an invisible, vast, distributed private club. Because knowing where the card was accepted, the geography of its transactional community, was key, the guidebook was an essential part of its technical apparatus. So even more so than the card, this kind of guidebook is like the main artifact here that I think is interesting. The guidebook reveals not just a differentiated geography, but it also differentiated movements through that geography, which in turn reveal differentiated transactional identities. For example, Black American business people were actively advertised to and accepted as members of the Diners Club. They were eager to become members in large part because being able to travel and transact freely and safely on highways held greater promise and higher stakes. Car ownership in mid-century America was seen for Black people as a step towards basic civil rights, freedom from segregated rail travel. But the so-called freedom of the open road was constrained by the private businesses that catered to those who traveled on it. Black Diners Club members were more likely to have their Diners Club card questioned or refused as a form of payment, according to reports in the Black press at the time. Even when Black travelers held advance registrations at hotels or Diners Club accounts, prejudiced hotel managers would refuse to accept the card. Unlike state currency, the Diners Club was not legal tender, but rather simply a third-party business that merchants were not obligated to accept. So even the most elite Black card members far from home could unexpectedly be relegated to cash-only status at any time. Even as they traveled on the same highway, those who paid with cash and those who paid with the Diners Club card each experienced a different landscape, a different transactional community. Today, at least in the US, hierarchy is baked into the design of credit card networks. All payment card transactions look the same. You swipe, it's accepted or declined, that's it. But under the surface, different cards are imbricated in different infrastructural, economic, and discursive assemblages. At every moment of payment, the Visa MasterCard network responds to the transactional identity of each cardholder and configures itself accordingly. From one customer card to the next, a single point of sale terminal may call forth countless configurations. Different pathways are opened and closed throughout the global financial infrastructure, and different algorithmic agents are set account balances, tallying interest, generating fees, and for some, producing rewards. So in short, some people, those with low credit scores, are paying very high fees every time they pay. whereas other people are getting back from their credit card issuer, getting paid back from their credit card issue in the form of rewards or even cashback bonuses every single time they swipe. For the privilege of the business of the rewards customers, merchants pay higher fees to the card issuer. These fees are then built into the way the merchant prices everything, raising costs for everyone. And rewards are built for different transactional lives, elite business travelers, but also long-haul truck drivers, as I discuss in the book. Indeed, the payments industry is a system of social categorization distinction, of membership and exclusion. The market segmentation of the issuing industry, the business of paying, creates a mass media transactional community that organizes the world into hierarchical transactional identities. Its open loop architecture enables communication among and across these hierarchies, all while maintaining them. And another example, that's built into most US card acceptance POS systems is the Ebt Card, or electronic benefits transfer, used by welfare recipients. And these are not only not able to be used everywhere, but rather can't be used to buy everything. So in the US, welfare recipients can't use their Ebt Card to buy prepared food, such as a warm rotisserie chicken. Hot chickens are usually loss leaders for grocery stores, meant to attract customers and price lower than raw chicken. But Ebt Cards can be used to buy cold rotisserie chicken that has been placed in a store refrigerator. So you can't buy a hot chicken, but you can buy a hot chicken that has been chilled. This is another example of unequal access points to our mass media transactional community. So now, if we see that the mass transactional communities were never quite as mass as we imagined, or that mass transactional community contained more inequality than we imagined, we are nonetheless now moving to a moment where payment is increasingly being produced, practiced, and understood as a form of social media. I understand social media as an industry, a way of talking about a set of technologies, and a modality of norms and engagements. It's an object of study, a theoretical lens, not a coherent empirical truth, much like mass media itself. Most social networking sites, so in the last 10 years, most social networking sites, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Google, have attempted to include a payment system in their platform offerings, and payment, as in the case of Venmo, which combines person-to-person payment with a social feed, is starting to look more and more like social media. So payment is becoming social. Social media is trying to do payment. Social media works social media payments work by recognizing the social in payments and enclosing it. As Silicon Valley discovers payments, they're doing so according to social media business logics. Many companies are hoping to harness the promise of transactional big data and put it into a conversation with other social data sets. These systems are governed according to practices native to Silicon Valley, such as click-through terms of service agreements. They are organized according to economic arrangements, also native to Silicon Valley, such as venture capitalism. The goal of fintech is to disrupt payment by redirecting the flow of payment revenues and data through Silicon Valley's digital warehouses and toll roads. At the same time, it's worth noting that in many places, especially the US, most people don't have a way to communicate at the speed and scale of our communicative lives. The card network was designed for an economy that imagined people as consumers who paid and businesses as merchants who got paid. It's a very kind of mid-century imaginary of what the economy looks like and how it's supposed to function. And that those transactions mostly happened in person. It was not designed for a messier, less dyadic, more geographically far-flung communicative and economic worlds. And so in designing payments for the internet era, for both people to send and receive money, fintech companies have created layers and layers that are often quite complicated and quite kludgy, that sit new systems that kind of sit on top of the old ones. Users are subjected to experimental systems of predictive analytics to manage these systems. There are countless examples of people suddenly losing access to their accounts and losing their ability to pay or be paid. Yet blocked users often have no means of challenging the platform's assessment of themselves and their transactions. As one user told me of their platform, online platform payment, it's the worst of both worlds. It's like a bank with the customer service of Facebook. Any person who wants to get paid electronically is beholden to systems governed in ways that are inconsistently enforced, experimental, opaque, and offer little recourse to contestation. And this is a particular example I explore in detail in the book that I'd be happy to talk more about in the Q&A. So in response to these perils, many are attempting to use technology to create new transactional communities according to different logics. Whether crypto, community, or corporate, many of these visions for the future of transactional communities are unlinked from the political and territorial structures of nationhood. Transactional communities are also then transactional publics. In the Enlightenment Project, money became the object of market democratic governance. Sociologist Georg Simmel argues that money is a claim upon society, that is, its value is derived from trust in collective systems. But as sociologist Nigel Dodd points out, it is far from obvious that the society Simmel had in mind when he was describing this was equivalent to a nation state. If society is not a fixed concept, then money too can be similarly fluid. All of these visions are, on some level, kind of reflective of a post-liberal democratic imaginary. The same forces driving the election of populist regimes all over the world have driven some to put their trust in libertarian global digital currency like Bitcoin, or try to use Ethereum and other systems to build local networks of resistance through community currencies. But there are other powerful platforms that are more aligned with traditional transactional communities, such as the nation state. A so-called everything app, WeChat, is used in China for everything. WeChat users can message friends, connect with business contacts, post photos and videos, read news articles, play games, order food, car services, pay bills, doctor's appointments, apply for visas, and of course, pay for everything. But the transactional community of WeChat is more geographically spread than the geography of China. WeChat Pay is currently accepted in 49 countries. Chinese visitor in the US, in Vegas, Chinese visitors to Caesars Entertainment-owned resorts are able to forego cash and cards and make payment entirely through WeChat Pay. They can book a room, buy coffee, a handbag, or tickets to a Britney Spears concert, all through WeChat. The only thing they can't do is through WeChat at Caesars is gamble. As the marketing director of Caesars says, we want to do this for our Chinese customers to make them feel at home. For Chinese tourists can now vacation in Las Vegas without ever handling US currency, without ever having to leave the transactional community of China. The spread of WeChat as a transactional community doesn't require official partnerships between global corporations. So at a Chinese restaurant here in Charlottesville, where I live, the owners accept payment in their WeChat account. The restaurant posts menu specials on their WeChat moments that appeal to Chinese international students' taste. And so at this small restaurant in Central Virginia, money moves from Chinese bank account to Chinese bank account inside WeChat Pay without ever leaving the Chinese transactional community. So by way of ending or moving towards an end, I would like to turn to a novel called The City in the City by China Mieville. It's kind of a sci-fi novel, kind of a detective procedural. But it imagines a bizarre landscape simultaneously occupied by two distinct cities, Basel and Ulkwoma. Okay, so although the cities are physically located in the same geographic space, they are experienced as two different places. Set somewhere in Eastern Europe, the two cities are marbled, but not fully they're fully superimposed, marbled, yet invisibly balkanized. It is left unexplained how and why the two cities came to be cleaved, as Mieville puts it, but the separation is now total. From birth, the residents of each city learn to unsee the other city and its people. They are disciplined to live their lives in only one city, completely separated from the other city. And breaching, so like even seeing the other city, is a crime worse than murder. Each city has its own distinct character. In one, people drink coffee, and the other tea. In one, there is a Cyrillic alphabet and the other Roman script. And of course, each city has its own currency. Should you dare to see them both, you would know them by their gait, citizens of each city by their gait, their affect, and their mode of payment. Money is one of the ways that the border between these two distinct realities is maintained. It is, of course, The City in the City is a work of fantasy, but it is a fantasy that is an exaggeration of mundane life in cities. We are disciplined to unsee the people and places we aren't meant to see. We all live within our bubbles, our cities within cities. And money forms produce and trace the boundaries of these worlds. So this center image is of a hotel where, and if you see it says, IGH Rewards Club floor. So when I book a hotel at a room at this hotel using my rewards credit card or rewards points, I do so through a different phone or different portal than other non-rewards guests do. I am charged different rates. I wait in a different line to check in. I'm treated differently by the front desk staff. I stay in a room on a designated rewards floor. Sometimes I have access to different breakfasts, different common areas, different Wi-Fi networks. These hotels are not, to use Mieville's term, cleaved, but they are cross-hatched. The same could be said for the truck stops where most car drivers never notice the truck driver rewards kiosks. They could be said for the same could be said for grocery stores where some customers know to avoid warm rotisserie chicken in favor of the chilled rotisserie chicken and then swipe cards that authorize payment for the latter but not the former. We all are already living within transaction sorted geographies, even if we don't know it. We don't yet know the shape of tomorrow's transactional media or the terrain of its transactional communities. Those that are emerging are the social media of money, private, surveilled, rooted in data-driven business models. Some are highly hierarchical and segmented. Some are universal and mass. Most require trusting unaccountable corporations with our money and our data, our ability to pay and be paid. Their segmentation means that you could be living in a completely different world than the person sitting next to you. Their plurality could mean that your transactional life is variegated, omnivorous, and constantly shifting between different monies, different transactional communities. If money is the skin of the state, these payment forms create new ways of communicating, of touching and not touching, of being in bodies, new states, and new skins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lana. That was absolutely fascinating. I can't quite believe that you managed to condense into 40 very entertaining minutes there. Amazing, thank you. Rebecca, I'd like to pass over to you, please, for your response.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lana. So in the field of communications and media, it's of course very widely understood that communicative processes are integral to every aspect of our social lives. But this recognition doesn't always lead us to look beyond media and communication systems and messages as they're traditionally conceived. And I think one of the reasons why Lana's work is so important is that it illustrates the potential for an expanded conception of communications and media that could open up new and vital areas of study. And there are many aspects of our social lives that remain underexplored from a communications and media perspective, and money is certainly one of these areas. And we can add to that other domains of that domain of our lives that we call the economy. With some notable exceptions, this is a domain that's really under-researched by media and communications. Lana's book and her broader research demonstrate the value and the distinctive perspective that communications and media can bring to bear on the domain of the economy. So in my short response to her talk, I'm going to draw out how her book has helped me to think differently about my main object of research, which is taxation. And I'm going to give just one example and then make some observations based on the kind of analysis that Lana offers in her book. So taxation is a particular kind of payment, a particular kind of transaction. Unlike many of the types of payment that Lana's been discussing this evening, taxation is not a payment associated with a great deal of agency, a great deal of choice. We don't get to choose whether or not to pay our taxes. We're compelled to pay them by state authorities, and there are predetermined ways in which we're required to make those payments. So, for example, people in the UK, many people pay their income tax through pay as you earn, which means that our employers deduct tax from our salaries before we've received it. If you have a car in the UK, you can still go down to the post office and pay for your vehicle tax in cash, but most people will pay it by direct debit online. So I think for these reasons, we're compelled to make the payment, and there are predetermined ways that we have to pay. the communicative aspects of taxation have not been very well explored to date. And yet, following Lana's lead, it's clear that there's a huge scope for interrogating the communicative politics of taxation and the ways in which this form of payment, this form of communication, constitutes communities. And in fact, I think there's a certain urgency to this investigation. So Lana's book points to multiple ways in which money and payment are becoming more social. Why shouldn't this apply to the payment or transaction that we call tax? Could it be that the becoming social of payment has consequences for this particular category of payment? So let me explain what I mean by comparing taxation and another system of payment, crowdfunding. So we might consider these to be completely different systems of payment or contribution. One, as I said, is managed by state authorities and operates on the basis of majority consent backed up by compulsion. And the other involves individuals choosing to contribute to certain projects and interventions in our social world, which might be charitable or philanthropic in nature. And yet it's widely recognised that there is a relationship between taxation and philanthropy. On the left, for example, we tend to want to defend taxation and denigrate philanthropy, often by recourse to Clement Attlee's famous pronouncement that charity is a cold, grey, loveless thing. If a rich man wants to help the poor, he should pay his taxes gladly, not dole out money at a whim. And there have always been grey areas between the two, payments that look something like a tax and something like a donation. For example, in Japan, citizens can opt to pay part of their income and resident tax to a town of their choice, which might be, but is not necessarily, their original hometown. Municipalities compete to attract these payments by offering goodies like locally produced rice or vegetables or sake, all promoted on social media, of course. So it looks like this gap between taxation and voluntary contribution is getting smaller. And I think we need theories of communication to understand this narrowing gap and the ways in which the payment we call taxation might be becoming more social. So let's think about the crowdfunding platforms that we're increasingly invited to use to contribute to proposed interventions in our societies. We might be asked to help fund someone's medical expenses, which is common, I understand, in the United States and increasingly prevalent in the UK as well. Or we might be invited to sponsor someone undertaking 100 laps around their garden, inspired by Captain Tom. Just a few days ago, a close friend of mine, currently living overseas, posted a message in our WhatsApp group, which we use to organise our annual in real life get together, sadly postponed this year. And he asked us to take a look at a GoFundMe site where he was trying to do some fundraising. The site described the initiative my friend was organising, a sponsored ride up a mountain to raise money for individuals affected by the pandemic in the country where he currently lives. Like other crowdfunding sites, GoFundMe allows donors to publicise or anonymise their donation. Most people on my friend's page chose to publicise their name alongside the size of their contribution. Other crowdfunding sites like Just Giving encourage donors to post messages alongside their donation. Go girl, or well done, great job. It's not hard to see that it is the communicative, expressive dimension of crowdfunded payments that are precisely their point. A minority might choose to remain anonymous, but in doing so, they're going to miss out on significant social rewards. By making their donation public, they gain an opportunity for positive identity formation within the transactional community that the crowdfunding effort encompasses and defines. The member of our group who responded most quickly to my friend's call out got to enhance his reputation as the nicest and most generous of us all. And my friend posted a message to the WhatsApp group affirming this. So these new forms of contribution have been made possible in the context of a digital economy in which crowdfunding platforms can be relatively easily assembled using off-the-shelf platform building tools. And they're clearly facilitating payments that are communicative and expressive to their core. They interact with other social media tools and spaces, such as WhatsApp and Facebook, and they shape and consolidate existing transactional communities as well as creating new ones. And there's a communicative politics to these payments. For who wouldn't like to have more control over the ways in which their social world is organised, helping those affected by the pandemic or short of the funds they need for an urgent medical procedure? And who wouldn't want to communicate with others their political priorities and their readiness to put their own money into making those priorities a reality? So crowdfunding platforms provide opportunities to make payments that are also messages, contributions that are expressive. And this raises questions about the implications for our tax systems, which don't offer anything like the same kinds of communicative, expressive opportunities. Paying tax is a ritual of citizenship, just like using tax, as Lana says in her book. And so it's always already communicative. In some countries, opportunities have been sought to expand the communicative dimensions of taxation. For example, by making citizens' taxable income public, as they do in Finland, or by declaring September the 9th National Taxpayer Appreciation Day, as happens in Somaliland. But by contrast with the opportunities that crowdfunding platforms offer, the expressive qualities of taxation have not yet been harnessed or even adequately recognised. On the contrary, the payment of income tax via PAYE is comparable to an anonymous donation to a crowdfunding site. In the context of proliferating opportunities to enhance our identities and shape interventions in our social worlds, what precisely is the point of paying tax? I say this as someone who is deeply committed to paying tax, and in the UK, as in many other European countries, there is still a high level of commitment to taxation as the best way of delivering collective social goods. But can this commitment prevail in a context where other, more expressive opportunities to contribute are flourishing? Will the authority of the state to extract contributions from its citizens be undermined by this emerging ecosystem of crowdfunding opportunities? Or can tax authorities learn from the becoming social of payment and find new ways of enhancing the expressive, communicative dimensions of paying tax? Lana's book has certainly made the communicative aspects of payment much more visible to me, and her talk this evening has underscored the urgency of thinking about these questions, as well as the unique perspective that media and communications can offer on some of the emerging problems of our time. So once again, thank you, Lana.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Rebecca, thank you. I'd actually just like to go a little bit off script, actually. Do you have 2 minutes, Lana, for a response to Rebecca's response before we turn to the questions?
I do. I was so compelled, and I can't wait to read more of that work as it emerges. Thank you so much. My kind of initial thoughts have to do with sort of always going to look more closely or think about my kind of close ethnographic work of infrastructures. And an interesting thing about the history of crowdfunding is that it was actually fairly difficult to get to figure out the infrastructural arrangements that would undergird crowdfunding. As you may know, it started off as a with Kickstarter and others, started off as kind of like crowdfunding products. So it wasn't necessarily charity. It was sort of like, let's get this product or business off the ground, and you will donate money to this campaign, and then you'll maybe get a prototype of the product or get other kind of rewards as you go. But early on, payment companies in the US, at least, were quite hesitant to support the kind of crowdfunding system, because they assumed most of these products would not come to fruition. So, most products don't come to fruition, and most people wouldn't get the prototype they had been promised and that sort of thing. And then everyone would want their money back. And then the payment processor would be required to refund, or rather the card issuer via the payment processing system would be required to refund everyone. So this kind of like temporality, there was a temporal problem as it related to crowdfunding, where it couldn't be, too far off in the future, or anyway, they had to really like nail down the contractual arrangements that would kind of bind this system. So it was kind of an achievement to figure out all the infrastructural arrangements of crowdfunding. And in the case that I describe, where or in the book, where a sex worker crowdfunds her medical expenses, it was precisely this kind of risk of fraud that caused her to fall afoul of terms of service and have her entire account refunded to people who donated money to her. She retweeted a tweet where one of her supporters offered a free pic set, meaning free pornography, to anyone who donated $100 to her crowdfunding campaign. She retweeted that, and then that was caught in the dragnet of surveillance that system uses to guarantee like no fraud, no prohibited activities, that sort of thing. And in that moment of retweet, it became not a transaction for crowdfunding, but a transaction for pornography. So you're kind of paying for pornography being a prohibited list of products prohibited by the payment processor, because historically there's the belief that there's a higher risk of chargebacks as it relates to pornography. So, it shows up on your credit card and someone says, "Oh, it wasn't me." They tell their spouse or parent, employer, "I didn't pay for this. I want my money back." So all of these kind of, that's where we get these kind of strange, kludgy layers of risk models and infrastructural arrangements. And crowdfunding, whether it's for products or for medical expenses, has been continuously particularly fraught as it relates to, I would say, both trust, risk, and time. And then the other example that I've begun to see quite a bit in the last year, mostly in reaction to the pandemic, are these sort of like crowdfunding situations where the people are increasingly calling mutual aid, where people in fact don't use these crowdfunding specific platforms, but instead merely advertise and then give money to someone who needs it, a stranger who needs it. So you'll see pop up on your Twitter or your Instagram, like mother of two, woman of color, unable to afford rent because of the pandemic. Here's the Venmo. And you're sort of just expected to give money, to take that leap of faith and send it to this completely anonymous, unknown person. And as I've been kind of attending to this, well, first off, I think it's interesting that we require the kind of social media and require Venmo to make connections between strangers, but also the kind of like dangerous moment of trust that is required to just do that, to just give money to a stranger, that seems to be almost directly in conversation with some of the more performative aspects of crowdfunding that Rebecca describes. And so, like, how do we think about the way that these kinds of anonymous mutual aid transactions dare people to rise above the kind of performative payments, as well as the infrastructural arrangements that make it possible? So super fascinating work. I'm very excited.
Thank you very much for your response, Lana. Thank you. I've got some questions coming in. I've got the first one here. I think this relates very much to something that sort of underpins some of your arguments, perhaps. Which is a sense of the kind of evolutionary direction, almost, if you like, of the. I'm sure you wouldn't use that kind of terminology, but the direction of change, if you like, from cash economies through to the newer types of payment economies you're talking about. Are you seeing this as a kind of, not so much almost becoming social, but a becoming redundant, if you like, of prior systems?
Well, I mean, one thing that's really remarkable about payments, and I think that this allows us to kind of reflect on media systems more broadly, is that none of these really go away. There's absolutely still checks, definitely cash still in circulation. I'd rather payment is a palimpsest, so we're constantly layering. And even if checks are probably in decline more than any other payment form, but the systems such as the automated clearinghouse, which is this kind of semi-public system run by the US Federal Reserve that makes checks happen, makes checks usable and automated, is the very same infrastructure that's used to power PayPal and Venmo and that sort of thing. So, checks, the kind of visual edge of checks might be in decline, but the infrastructures of checks and the checking account are more important than ever. So yeah, there's this kind of palimpsest feature to payment. And I think that by seeing that in payment, we can see it in other other forms of media. I do think that we'll likely, I'm always asked by journalists and such about like the coming cashless future. And I do think we will likely move into a situation where cash will be, that's kind of cash light. It's kind of like the idea of the paperless office, like their paperless office is as old as I am and I use paper all the time. But there is less paper, right? There's less card catalogs. There's less, paper file folders for everything. But I do think that a cash light world will not be evenly distributed. So there will be people who live most of their lives in the cash economy and people who never touch cash at all. And those will likely follow along existing, social inequalities. So when we think about, who moving away from cash, we have to think about who is kind of being cut out of various systems. I have a ongoing feud with a smoothie shop here who doesn't accept cash, and they also think of their money or their smoothies as like food is medicine. And I go in and yell at them about how they're denying their food is medicine to people who only use cash, and they're like, "Here comes that crazy woman again."
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've got a second question here now from someone who is a self-declared infrastructure theorist, and the question relates to Bitcoin and the question of whether any currency can be said to be truly free when it's entirely reliant on the telecommunications infrastructure over which the transactions take place.
I mean, there are many ways of defining free, but in terms of free as in how it's paid for, how it's subsidized. Bitcoin is absolutely subsidized by the national electronic grids of the places that produce it and host the blockchain. And I think it's always important to think about what the public systems are that enable these seemingly ephemeral kinds of virtual dematerialized systems. So yeah. I take their point and I agree.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Lana. So next question, this is from Professor Jonathan Hardy, and the question is about the term community and how you manage and reflect on the burdens of its organic associations when brought into relation with the analysis of transactions, so contact or exchange, for example, and your excellent critical attention to stratification and difference. You draw on Raymond Williams' structures of feeling, but the debates, tensions between Williams and Stuart Hall's on community seem very relevant here. That's kind of a statement, but I think there's a question sort of embedded in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I definitely take pains to, sorry, my sound. Okay, I definitely take pains to ensure that it's clear that I'm partaking of neither the normative positive dimensions of the word community nor the normative negative dimensions of the word transactional. So, and to the former point, I definitely draw from feminist scholars in particular who demonstrate that the word community is itself fundamentally about the production of inclusions and exclusions. And I have struggled with the use of that term because I do not mean to imply a kind of romantic notion of what community is. I also think about, say, Zimmel, who writes about how, for a long time, most humans lived in relatively small villages where they knew everyone and everyone knew who their grandparents were and who their children were and where they lived. And for the most part, they didn't use money. For the most part, they used systems of accounts, right? They just sort of kept track of their obligations to each other. And then Zimmel describes how entering the modern metropolis, entering the city and using paper currency meant being untethered from the tyranny of community, right? Yeah. Of being able to transact as a stranger, to be able to not necessarily need to trust, trust in the positive sense, but also trust in a very constrained sense, the individual, but instead just kind of externalize that trust onto the money form. And that this kind of anonymous money untethered from community enabled the the modern city to exist at all. So I think that it's very important that we attend to the feminist critiques of community and attend to the ways that community is, even in its most romantic forms, fraught with patriarchy and a near kind of suffocating kind of bondage to each other.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I've got a question here from Bellen, and the question is, does look a little bit like a statement, so hopefully there is a question embedded in here. It seems to me that while payments are becoming social media, at the same time financial technologies are drastically isolating our money lives and stopping other forms of financial collaboration. For instance, cash can be easily given to someone else to buy something on our behalf, but giving our strictly personalised bank card to someone else to do the same will breach our bank's terms and conditions and void our fraud protections. Are payments as social media a superficial substitute for more meaningful forms of impersonal finance? Wow.
I think I kind of, it's always a struggle to sort of disentangle attempts to do critique versus attempts to kind of think about normative dimensions of what's more meaningful and what isn't more meaningful. But I actually think Rebecca's work, as she just described, on attempts to do crowdfunding, put into conversation perhaps with some of the infrastructural work that I write about in the book, where it's like how hard it is to actually produce a crowdfunding infrastructure and how kludgy they are, how broken they are, how often they do such a disservice to the people, via their instability who attempt to use it. So I absolutely think that like digging deep into these infrastructures and trying to see how poorly they attempt to do the thing that they're trying to do, allegedly trying to do, is really important.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the, I think the question here is trying to get at interpersonal financial cooperation is actually being prevented by the types of transaction that you're talking about happening through the social media networks.
Right. So if we think about the way we live our lives now, for the most part, as Rebecca described, yes, we could give cash, but how would Rebecca give cash to her friend living in another country to try to create a network of collaboration, a network of mutual aid in that country where Rebecca's friend lives? Our lives, for better or worse, are lived through communication infrastructures that are global, or at least translocal. I could go around and pass the hat, but I'd have to fly all over the world to get everyone to put their money into the hat. So the question is not, does the fact that they're geographically dispersed make our relationships less authentic or less meaningful or whatever, but okay, how do we build systems that can afford collaboration of this kind at the scope and scale of our lived communicative lives? And right now, because of the fact that systems are so layered with legacy systems on top of new systems are being repurposed and kludgily used for things that they were never intended to be used for, because the original systems were not designed for the way we lived our communicative lives now, and the new systems are kind of weird kludges on top of that, it makes it very difficult to figure out how to build those systems. And I don't think that I'm not giving the kind of social media companies an out by saying it's difficult, but I am saying that we need to, I think, look at the labor of the production of these systems, and to and of course, I think some of these slipping through the cracks is a result of just like not really caring, like the sort of like social media era rushing to get a product out, a social media era need to live in permanent beta. So, systems are never done. They're just good enough. And then they're constantly getting updated as they go. And the goal of most social media systems is to get to scale as soon as possible, rather than, and get as many people using it and then probably get acquired by a larger company, rather than produce a stable infrastructure that works for everyone all the time and is meant to live on for 50 years. So I think that we need to rethink. We need to create space to recognize the labor of infrastructural maintenance, and we need to rethink the entire political economy of social media and the Silicon Valley logics, if we want to imagine systems that are stable and predicated on offering value beyond mere extraction of our social data.
Great, thank you very much. Zoe, do we have any more questions?
No, but if anyone does have a question, they're welcome to type it into the Q&A. There is one last one that's there, Steve, if you're looking for.
Yes, sorry, I've just noticed that's come in now, yeah. Right, so I think the point that money and payment systems relate to transactional collectivities, given the move towards social media money, what are these collectivities going to look like? Oh, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we will likely see ones that look sort of like WeChat Pay or like some Facebook version thereof that map to existing structures of power, and that likely contain within them invisibly these kinds of subnetworks of care, but also of hierarchy. And I think that our transactional lives will likely be, I don't think we'll see any like major displacement of state issued currency, but I think we will see increasing monetary plurality, where we're thinking about our lives across multiple different payment forms, multiple different payment systems, and that those two will be marked by hierarchy and difference. So, yeah.
Okay. I've got another question here now. How do you feel about blockchain's ability to create artificial scarcity and emerging markets in crypto collectibles, the commodification of user-generated content types of media which were previously uncommodifiable?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've written a bit about blockchain apart from payments exactly, and I think that blockchain has proven to be a tremendous site of creativity where people are imagining all sorts of different ways to do money, but also to do anything that can be done with a ledger, including, as the question asker asks or describes, create artificial scarcity around the things that are thought of as like endlessly mechanically reproducible, like music or other kinds of collectibles, little crypto kitties or whatever. And I think that but my big question about crypto or about these blockchain projects is always sort of, well, my first question is always like, what blockchain where? Like, who are the kind of peers that are producing and hosting this blockchain? What is the political economy of that, of the blockchain itself? And is it actually like as distributed as folks would like to imagine it is? And then also, the question I have about blockchain is, to what extent are these ways of kind of doing design fiction and kind of telling stories about things you could possibly do in some version of an implementable future, and then to what extent are they actually imagining infrastructural alternatives that can work at scale with everyone in a way that's actually meaningful? I wrote a piece with Nancy Boehm and Andrea Alarcon about the way that that blockchain often serves as what we call a convening technology that seems to bring people together, bring diverse constituents together who don't normally talk to each other, but are kind of are seen as on opposite sides of certain issues, but are brought together because blockchain offers some kind of vision of the future. It marshals resources, it marshals legitimacy, and it has this tremendous rhetorical power to kind of create a convening. And then when these people actually can get together and actually talk through and give name to their problems and create an inventory of their actual technical problems, they tend to realize that those problems aren't so much technological and therefore can be fixed by a new technology like a blockchain, but are social, are political, or economic, have more to do with contracts and laws and relationships. And so you can't really create a kind of technological solution to a social problem. But by virtue of them being able to kind of take inventory of these problems, they do kind of make a step forward towards like figuring out a range of possible ways forward. So I think that, and then oftentimes the technological solution or technological advancement that comes out of that is not in fact a blockchain, but is something else.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of different kinds of uses for blockchains and the idea of blockchains.
Thank you so much. This isn't a question, it's a comment, and it isn't actually from your mum, who I know is one of our students.
I don't know if she got on. Did she get on? Well, hi Mom, if you're there.
This is from one of our students who just says, I just want to say this is one of the most interesting lectures I have ever watched.
Oh,
and asks where he or she can buy the book. So I think probably a bookstore once they reopen.
Wherever books are sold. Yeah.
And I've got another question here from Clear Bourne. Thank you so much, Lana. Stable systems, value and infrastructure is an interesting point for thinking about social media and credit scoring too, I think. New forms of, I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to scroll down a little bit here. New forms of credit scoring were on the rise before COVID, but ultimately will respond to social change caused by COVID. Have you been able to focus on this much in 2020?
So in 2020, in response to COVID, what I have actually been not so much the credit scoring question, although that's really, really interesting and really important. What I have been doing is I have been doing interviews with small business owners in the context of COVID and the ways in which most of this research that informs the book looks at people and consumer financial services, and there isn't, and just as there's very little research on people, there's similarly also very little research on small businesses and how they are increasingly constitute themselves via platforms. So like all small businesses are increasingly obliged to be on social media. They use platforms like payment platforms for almost everything, inventory management platforms, platforms to order inventory and order things that they sell, and platforms to ship them out. And like by being a small business means to like live via platforms in a way that I think most of us don't fully realize. And so I've been doing research. I had this kind of ongoing project that looked at the Fintechification of small businesses, especially at a time when I think more than ever, small businesses are valorized on both the left and the right. On the left in the US, of course, as being an alternative to kind of a, corporatism and be a kind of like local and as a way of celebrating localism, and on the right as a kind of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, being an entrepreneur, that sort of thing. And at a time when these kinds of entrepreneurial life paths are more celebrated than ever. So whether that's like being an influencer or creating some kind of online shop, entrepreneurialism is seen as kind of a very important value. So in the context of COVID, what happens to, how do small businesses shift or respond in the context of the platform economy when suddenly, in order to survive, all small businesses, as one business owner told me, have to become online businesses? How do they, how has Main Street reconstructed itself on Instagram as a kind of hybrid physical digital place? How are they, selling things locally online using platforms that were built for transgeographic commerce? And it's been very interesting. So I've seen a lot of, in a moment like COVID, the kinds of working capital loans that fintech companies often offer to small businesses become all the more important. In the US, we have seen small businesses or fintech companies be lenders for the PPP, which is the Payroll Protection Program, which is the only provision offered to small businesses as COVID relief. And how are these deepening the small businesses entanglements with fintechs? So that research is ongoing, and I think will be quite interesting. And yeah, the other project I'm doing right now is scams. So I'm really interested in uncanny e-commerce, or like deviant, what one of my colleagues called deviant globalization. So these kinds of, how do we think about what kinds of activity are considered and what kinds of exploitation are considered legitimate and illegitimate, what are considered scams, what are considered not scams, and sort of doing a shadow history of the internet through a history of internet scams, and looking at the way that definitions of scamfulness have influenced the development of the social and commercial web. And then looking at the way that sort of strange e-commerce is, whether it's overt scams, multi-level marketing companies, financial dominatrixes is another category. Just these kind of strange commerce opportunities that are kind of proliferating in the interstices of social media, and then what infrastructures support them.
Excellent, thank you very much. We've just another superlative here, that the most presentation ever has popped into our comment box. Any further questions, though?
No, there's no further questions.
Good.
But that might be a nice reminder for anyone who wants to bring them in. And
yeah. I have a question, and if there are no further questions, which may also sound a little bit like a statement initially. You talk about the way that we can map some of the changes that are emerging onto structures of power, but elsewhere in the book you say that, for example, talking about WeChat, it's aligned with nation states but not fully overlapping with them. And I think, and possibly this is because the book itself sounds or feels like it's pregnant really with kind of possibilities that you're kind of tracking as emerging, and so forth. I think there's a strong sense in it that what used to be called globalization is something that's now kind of emerging through these. I mean, you've just used the shadow term, but these processes are perhaps things that have been under the radar, and that globalization as a thing in itself is something that's anyway deeply contested, and deeply contested in the sense that it's obviously not a sort of evolutionary set of processes that are emerging. Have you thought about that set of possibilities in relationship to the full decomposition of the nation state?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating formulation, and I like the way that you describe that. I will say, like the book, I was quite pregnant while I was writing it, but funnily enough, but yeah, I think that, so the kind of response that occurs to me, which isn't a full response, but I think a hopefully interesting one, is that oftentimes, is that many times these financial infrastructures emerge in response to existing activity that was previously unseen or unrecognized by structures. So, there are economic flows of remittances or economic flows of exchange that existed, and people kind of had to try to figure out a way to make them happen. And we're always quite good at doing that kind of problem solving. And then someone comes along and sees that activity and thinks of it as a market opportunity and builds an infrastructure to accommodate that, and suddenly it's reified via an infrastructure. So I think that we will see, and then sometimes it's not. So then sometimes things don't look like market opportunities, and they remain in the kind of sub rosa realms of kind of people's ingenuity to make them happen. So along those lines, an area that I'm very interested in and hope to write about. My colleague Alice Marwick is also someone who's been very interested in this space. So I wrote a master's thesis almost over a decade ago on counterfeit luxury goods and kind of the global traffic in counterfeit luxury goods. And I was interested in these online communities of people who consider themselves to be connoisseurs of the fake. They're totally uninterested in like the real Louis Vuitton bag. They're fascinated in being the one that's able to have the expertise and truly global social network, and the ability to kind of travel over a variety of different financial and communicative and transactional infrastructures in order to achieve the perfect fake. So, they would say things like, only I have the not, anyone with $1,000 can go buy a reel. Only I, because of my knowledge and network and $500 can buy the perfect fake. And so more recently, I wrote my thesis a long time ago, but more recently these communities have gotten quite sophisticated and fascinating. The people on the subreddit Rep Ladies, for example, will figure out how to download Taobao, which is a Chinese e-commerce system, use Google Translate, use a variety of different stepwise transaction systems in order to get money from them to agents in China, who then go around to the different factories, the different artisans really who are producing these perfect fakes, and then use oftentimes not the quickest or fastest global shipping system, because those would be more likely to be seized by customs, to get the bag back to them. So it's commerce as a hobby really that requires a lot of various technological skill and social skill to kind of make it work, and is global, but will likely never be developed as an infrastructure because it still kind of sits in this illicit realm. So I think that part of your question, the answer to your question really is what I hope to achieve with this coming book, that is not really a book yet, but this next project, I guess you could say, which is to really attend to the global financial flows that are informal, but not necessarily informal the way we've always thought about them, but kind of sit outside and kind of provide an uncanny foil to the stories we normally tell about globalization, and then look at how they both sit on infrastructures, but also do or do not encourage the production of new infrastructures.
Thank you. Zoe, I'd just like to turn to you for a moment. I know that you have almost certainly got a question before we close.
Oh my goodness, I so do actually. So thank you very much for that opportunity. Lana, I do have to say your work is really fascinating, and like Rebecca, has really helped me think about social media and new territories of fintech systems. So I'm really grateful for that. So my question, I guess, is related to the fact that fintech and social media are predominantly located in two geographic locations, right? And this perhaps relates to Steve's comments. We've got Silicon Valley and we've got China. So what are the implications for this, globalized localization almost, particularly when we're thinking about not just surveillance, but I suppose the other framework which you introduce, which is about collectivities. So that's kind of a broad question, but I'm also trying to make sense of this myself. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on those tensions.
Yeah. So I mean, I think part of the project with thinking about the small businesses and the platform economy is also to kind of rethink our notion of like what online commerce is, or what digital commerce is, and to kind of show the way that it's sort of geographically diffuse, and to kind of interrogate those geographies a bit and kind of look at the way that certain forms of commerce are almost are framed or are asked to perform as consumers, and then others are more like vendors, or we could think back to Rebecca's work on tax and think about like the way that some are infrastructure producers and others are asked to pay a tax or fee or tribute in order to ride those rails, and kind of looking back and thinking about historically the way that those sort of look like what the function of the state has been. And so like as we think about the way that taxation is withering, the way that we instead are paying fealty, fine, and tribute tax to other kinds of infrastructure holders, whether or not we realize it. So it's not just a matter of tax, like the state withering and taxation withering, and then thinking about new ways to give money to the collectivities, but kind of think about what other kinds of broker or infrastructural brokers in what ways a new infrastructural state is forming. And then what is the geography of that? And then the other thing, though, I do want to say is one thing I've learned about in the last almost a decade of looking at fintech is that it's almost always like people always talk about payments as a two-sided market, so that there's like a broker, or it's like a brokerage with consumers and merchants on either side. But really, these systems are so complicated that they're almost always these like deeply complex, multi-layered markets, where there's an issuing bank, there's an acquiring bank. There's usually many layers of acquiring banks. There's processors, there's back-end processors, front-end processors, gateways. Even something like Square, which is an attempt to kind of remediate and kind of housemanize, like wipe out all of that complexity and recreate a new one, winds up being this kind of complicated kludgy system. And so while the geography of fintech, the fintech platforms, is like Silicon Valley and China, all the things they depend on in order to function at all, because they're actually not that innovative and they're not inventing something whole cloth as they would like you to believe, are dependent on both like traditional state or quasi-public infrastructures like the automated clearinghouse, or on the traditional banking network, or on these kind of like invisible industry of payments that really is geographically dispersed, that doesn't have to be in any one of these cities. So I think it's important to like really look at all the long history of industry that all Silicon Valley companies are grafting themselves onto and sort of claiming ownership of, even as they attempt to disrupt and replace those systems.
Yeah, great. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you. So, do you have any further comments, though?
I mean, I just think that's that's interesting, and I really like your characterization there of how it's overlaid on state or private corporate banking. So does that mean? Sorry, just one more clarification. Does that mean that you think we're not going to be facing a future where, say, Facebook, Libra, and WeChat are going to be dominating our economic system? Because it sounds like in some ways you think that's not the case, which is hopeful, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I don't think so. I'll say I don't think Libra. I think one thing to note so Libra kind of crashed and burned, and there was all this like Schadenfreude around it. And I'm not saying that Libra will not, or some other version of it will not come back. But I do think if you notice, like right around the time people were all kind of laughing about the kind of fall of Libra, Facebook launched Facebook Pay, which has none of the same kind of like cool crypto aspirations like as Libra, but instead is just a payment system that lives inside of Facebook. But that's I think insidiously just as powerful as something that claims to be a cryptocurrency and claims to be all like revolutionary and radical. So I think that it oftentimes the kind of crypto or blockchain or token edge of this is a red herring for the ways that other forms of power, infrastructural power, surveillance power, etc., are being assembled. And somewhat more stealthily, somewhat more boringly. So like pay attention boringly. I'm at that stage of the talk where I'm saying things like boringly, but that's okay. And less interestingly. But I think that, so yes, so I think like pay attention to the boring things. But so, and then I guess I will say in terms of like, how network power is wielded, I do think that Facebook or WeChat or other like powerful entities will likely be the key gateways of all of these systems, and will be the most able to powerfully compel all the infrastructures that they use and are built on to act. And they'll be the way most people interface with and imagine all of these systems. Right now, I absolutely could not tell you all the parties that are involved in every single payment I make. And if we're living in a new transactional order where I'm primarily doing those payments through Facebook, I guarantee many of those parties will still be in place, and I still couldn't tell you who they were. So just because they exist and just because they're really important infrastructures in terms of assembling these systems doesn't mean they kind of have power within those systems. So I think it's like a mix of attending to like how and why these kind of sub rosa systems become important, but also not overestimating the way in which, even though these systems are highly variegated, power itself is not variegated. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I would love to just talk with you guys all about all of this, and over drinks.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe that's the moment to. Oh, I have a comment. Sorry. Like the comments on online payment providers offering their customer services of Facebook. Do you have any views on Facebook's Libra project? Oh, you've just answered that question. And it's aimed to be a bank, payment system, and digital currency, as well as a customer service center. I think has that been answered sufficiently?
Yeah, I think time will tell. I mean, I think that Libra was a lightning rod for public attention and regulatory attention, but I don't think that it needs it. I think that all of these other insidious, boring attempts by Facebook are all the more powerful. So we do need to stay vigilant. But yeah, I do think Facebook is going to be tremendously powerful in this space.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So, anything further from yourself?
No, there's no more questions. I think you've answered everything really brilliantly, Lana. Thank you so much. Really very thought-provoking. And also, just to add, which I'm sure Steve will step in, there's been tons of comments about, fascinating topic, fascinating talk. So thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, actually a question as well about would it be possible? Do you want to share any of your social media handles? Because there's a lot of students who would like.
Oh yeah. I'm on Twitter, although not as much as I used to be, at Lana, so just my name twice. And then I can easily be reached by that same address at Gmail. So
cool. Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay, great. I'd just like to extend again a really, really heartfelt thank you. That was a deeply interesting talk and presentation, and obviously generated a lot of interest from particularly from our students, which I'm delighted to see. So again, thank you very much, Lana. That this was the first of our annual lectures, so we got off to an absolutely astounding start, and I'm utterly fascinated to read the next sort of stage of this project, which you've tantalizingly done.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. This was a pleasure.
Right. Thank you very much. Okay.